Hi everyone, I'm Esther and welcome back to Parenting Insight. This is part 2 on the series of language, identity and status in Kenya. And as promised, I'm going to share a little bit about how I acquired the 3 Kenyan languages that I speak, the 2 national languages, which are English and Swahili, and also my tribal language, which is Kikuyu, Kikuyu being one of the 42 tribes in Kenya. Now, my first 2 years, my parents spoke to my siblings and I mostly in Kikuyu because we lived in a community where Kikuyu, our tribal language, was a predominant language in the community. It's not to mean that we did not speak Swahili. Swahili is a basic Kenyan language which most people, old and young, are comfortable using because having 42 tribes means we need to have a mutual language where we can communicate with each other if our tribal languages are not something that either of us are familiar with. The next 3 years, more Swahili was integrated into our communication, and so there was an interplay between Kikuyu and Swahili, but still predominantly we communicated in Kikuyu because, as I mentioned, it was the predominant language of communication in the community. My parents thought that it was important to learn the local language because it helped us to be able to interact with the people in our community, and also it was key for my parents that we were able to interact with my grandparents and elderly people in the community who may not have been very comfortable with communicating in Kiswahili. At age 5, I joined formal school, and that's when the English language became the predominant language because it was the language of instruction, and so this continued through my school years all through to tertiary education. And that is how, despite the fact that my formative language was Kikuyu, second was Swahili, and third was English, because of having to use English more than any of the other 2 languages, English quickly overtook the Kikuyu and the Swahili and became my predominant language. So as you know, if you're multilingual, you do have a core language in which you construct your thoughts and through which you see the world, and then you translate those thoughts into other languages. So English is my predominant language. I see the world and I construct, I make sense of the world in the English language. And if I have to speak Swahili, I then translate my thoughts from English to Swahili or from English to Kikuyu. So I had 2 formative years of spoken Kikuyu language. And also just to mention that when I went to formal school, I did formally learn English and Swahili, which means that I can read and write in Swahili, but I cannot read and write in Kikuyu. So my Kikuyu is purely spoken, which means that when I speak English or Swahili, I do have a visual cue of the language. But when I speak Kikuyu, I do not have a visual image of what the Kikuyu language is. So it's more, to my mind, it's a language which is more in a crammed format. My mind interacts more deeply with the English language just because I use it predominantly, and then with the Swahili language because I learned it and I do interact in the Swahili language. And I've noticed mostly on 2 occasions, if the person I'm interacting with initiates conversation in Swahili, then I respond in Swahili. Or if I'm communicating with someone and I notice that they're more comfortable with the Swahili language, then I'm very comfortable interacting in Swahili. But left to my own, my default language of communication is English. So if I was to give the 3 languages my hierarchy of use, I would say predominantly use English, maybe 90% of the time, and Swahili maybe 9% of the time, and Kikuyu maybe 1% of the time. Another thing that I've found to be very interesting about my use of the Kikuyu language is that unlike English and Swahili, which I use depending on the people I'm communicating with and their preference and the comfort with the languages, Kikuyu is a very compartmentalized language for me. So it's a language that I have marked certain people with whom I can use the Kikuyu language. So Kikuyu for me has always been the language that I interacted with my grandparents, was a language that I responded to if my parents initiated communication in Kikuyu. So Kikuyu for me is a very compartmentalized language because it's not a language that I would use with anybody like I would switch to Swahili with just about anybody or switch to English with just about anybody. Kikuyu is like a language that I've made exclusive to certain people who are a very small circle in my life. I will put a pause on me and mention a little bit about my parents because I'm trying to bring about the dynamics of language and how different people interact with languages differently. And so I think even just using an example of a family where we lived in the same household but we interacted with the three languages very differently just brings to light the dynamics of language and how we all create different core languages. So my mom is Kikuyu. She was born in a predominantly Kikuyu inhabited area. So her language of socialization was Kikuyu. Unlike me who started school at 5, in her time they started formal school at 7. And also in her time, if you went to a local school, which was predominantly attended by children from the community who are predominantly from the same tribe, the first 3 years of learning instruction was done in your local language, which brings the difference between how my mind interacts with Kikuyu and how my mom's mind interacts with Kikuyu, because unlike me, she can read and write Kikuyu and of course speak it. So when I speak Kikuyu and when my mom speaks Kikuyu, our minds have sort of different reference because mine is just purely a spoken language that I do not have a visual image of what I'm saying, which is very different from when my mom speaks Kikuyu because she can read it and write it. So her mind interacts with Kikuyu maybe in the same way that my mind interacts with the English language. And then we put a pause on mom, and then we go to my dad, who grew up in the city here in Nairobi, in a very eclectic cosmopolitan community where there was no particular tribe that predominantly made up his community because he lived in the city. And so people from all tribes in Kenya coexisted together. And so his core language was Swahili. So unlike my mom and myself, he saw the world through the Swahili language. And I must mention that his Swahili was very, very good. It was more coastal or more like the Tanzanian language, what we call Swahili Sanifu, like proper Swahili. And so, as you can see, in the same family, in the same household, different people having different core languages. For my dad, it was Swahili. For my mom, it was Kikuyu. And for me, it was English. And that just brings to light the dynamics of language and how we interact with languages in the world. And so this is just an example of the different ways that we as Kenyans need to appreciate that we see the world differently. Why we are so rich in terms of diversity of tribal accents and in terms of how we communicate, the different languages that we do, and also to help our children embrace who they are and understand that it's a beautiful thing to be able to switch languages, but also be able to appreciate that it is not necessary for all of us to sound alike. And children also need to understand that it's not necessary for them to sound alike and that there's no one particular way of speaking that should be considered ideal. We don't have a problem of language scarcity. We have a problem of language surplus. My challenge to you is to think through the autonomous tribes in Kenya and why different tribes have different challenges pronouncing certain sounds or certain words or certain letters, and you'll be amazed at the things you may discover about your language and about other people's languages. So thank you so much for your time. Stay tuned for part 3 and see you on the next one.